Good evening, everybody. I don't know if you guys have attended one of our law school webinars before, and this is maybe our 15th or so. We've been going for some time on areas of interest of law school staff and expertise. And our speaker this evening, Carole Lyons, a colleague in the law school, has given one Brexit related, or had a conversation with me in a Brexit related webinar some time ago, and we thought it was appropriate to do it again, and that's what we're going to do. And also, but to help us and to guide us and maybe help you, what we're going to do this time is to I'm going to share my screen. There it goes. I think it's going to work. And so we have a PowerPoint that's going to condition our discussion tonight. And so I just want to make sure I can do this. There we go. And hopefully I'm going to manage the technology. I'm in charge of clicking through the slides, so I hope I do that without making a mistake. Well, great. So I'll begin again. So welcome everybody to our webinar, our law school webinar, part of our law school webinar series. We have Carole Lyons, who's kindly agreed to share her interest and expertise in Brexit with us tonight. And when Carole and I had a discussion, I don't know, several months back when we were putting the program together, and we were thinking of having a follow-on webinar to our first one, we were wondering, well, what should it be titled, or what should we ask? What questions should we consider? And what we alighted on was the title of tonight's presentation and conversation, Brexit done, the promised land ? And so we're going to address, I guess there's two questions there, at least two, or probably a lot more than that, whether in fact Brexit is done, and then whether we are now in the promised land, I suppose, literally or metaphorically. So that's what we're going to do for the next 45 minutes or so, and go through the slides, and then like usual, we'll have a short time at the end for any questions. So as I've just mentioned, there's two main, I guess, components or topics to our webinar this evening. Is in fact Brexit done? Can we kind of forget about it now and move on, or not? And the second question, whether some of the promises that were made, I guess that's one meaning or of the promised land, are in fact coming to fruition. Okay, so welcome, Carole. Thanks for coming. And we're going to move on now to as our first question, and I guess one of the most basic ones. Well, then, is Brexit done now? Or can we just sit and relax and forget about it?
Thank you very much, Paul. Unfortunately, I don't think any of us can actually sit and relax. But just to start off with the basics, at some very basic level, indeed, Brexit is, of course, done. Because unfortunately, I see our images maybe obscuring some of the slides. But I'm sure, as most of the audience here tonight realize, that Brexit was a two-stage process. The UK first formally left the EU on 31 January 2020. So that was our formal date of leaving on the basis of the infamous Article 50 of the Treaty of European Union. Then that was, if you like, to use jargon or a cliche, that was the divorce agreement. That was what took the UK out of the EU. However, they then had to follow the management of the future relationship. What happens after the divorce? How do we divide up the property effectively? Sorry, again, to keep going with the metaphor. So the second stage of Brexit was achieved, and this is now done, was achieved rather dramatically on Christmas Eve just last year. I'm sure most of us may recall the rather tortuous end to Brexit, which came with a document called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, signed by the EU and the UK on Christmas Eve of 2020. So in that sense, yes, Brexit is done, formally and legally it is done. But that's just the start of the story, really.
Okay, so in one sense, I guess the mechanics in that very general sense, whoopsie, there we go, came to a conclusion at the end of 2020, and so leaves us where we are now, only 3-4 months down the road, and we've got various sticky notes here on our slides, and I guess these are giving the underpinning to those agreements that you've just mentioned. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Thank you, Paul. Sorry, I've got something popping up on my screen. Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to flag up the names of those actual formal agreements which brought about Brexit, this two-stage process. The first stage was achieved by the withdrawal agreement of 2019, and that importantly incorporates the Northern Irish Protocol, of which we shall speak a little bit later. And the second stage was achieved by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement of Christmas Eve 2020, effectively. And those are both international agreements, and they underpin legally and formally the whole process of Brexit. And then in the black, we talk about those slightly later on again. Also, in the black text, just an indication of the United Kingdom legislation, which followed through, if you like, domestically on those two international agreements. So that's just an overview of the terminology in case the audience isn't familiar with that.
So that just brings to my mind a very important point that I teach my students when in my human rights class, in that there's in a sense two levels, or one way to think about it, two types of law: public international law forming treaties by and large, and then of course domestic law, and in the United Kingdom context, the most important being acts of the UK Parliament. And so I guess the different colors denote those different forms of law.
Absolutely correct, Paul. Very well put for the constitutional lawyer that I know you to be. Indeed, the red text signifies the international treaties signed between the UK on the one hand and the EU on the other hand. And then the black text indeed is the domestic legislation, all passed by the Westminster Parliament, giving domestic effect to those two international agreements.
Excellent. So that's what I was thinking. There we go. So I guess we have a little more discussion specifically about those agreements, and I guess the first one chronologically was with the withdrawal agreement. Well, what is it, and what does it cover?
Okay, well, the first thing I thought was useful to put on this slide, because we have all been so bamboozled by terminology about the deal, about the slogans which have dominated the Brexit process over the almost last 5 years. I thought the first thing which was useful to put on was an image, of course, used by the Conservative Party in the lead up to the general election in December 2019, namely this idea of the oven-ready deal. Now, it's easy for people who are not as obsessed with Brexit as I may be to get confused with what deal is this? What were they talking about? Well, this was, of course, Mr. Johnson's way of describing the withdrawal agreement. Now, the withdrawal agreement actually went through two different versions. It was largely negotiated by Theresa May with the EU when she was Prime Minister. But then when Mr. Johnson became Prime Minister in summer 2019, he then waded in because she had been unable to get the withdrawal agreement accepted by the Westminster Parliament. He waded in and apparently produced a whole new agreement, which he then called the oven-ready deal, okay, which he alleged was a whole new agreement. In fact, he changed only one small part of it compared to Mrs. May, namely he changed a significant part of the Northern Ireland Protocol. So that's just to give some sort of chronological context to what this is. But effectively, the withdrawal agreement, Paul, is the international treaty produced under the procedure laid out in the EU treaties, whereby a state can leave the EU. As I'm sure we all know, the UK is the only state which is left. So this is the very first withdrawal agreement that has ever been produced between the EU and a former partner, a former fellow member state. And effectively, it is as I said already, it's kind of seen as the divorce agreement, okay? It controls the terms by which the exiting member state can leave. And in this particular instance, it includes important provisions about citizens' rights. We'll come a little bit more to those later. that is basically EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. It includes various separation provisions and issues. It provided for transition, which of course is now past and has lapsed. It included, importantly, the financial settlement, namely how much the UK owed the EU after departure, various technical long governance procedures. And as I say, importantly, because many people get confused between the sequence of events, it has attached to it a protocol which has the same legal status. It has a protocol governing what should happen between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So that's really what it contains. Very important document, and it is the so-called famous oven-ready deal which Mr. Johnson took with him to gain his electoral victory on the 12th of December 2019.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. And I guess what springs to my mind is, these issues are many, if not all of them, are still live. You in the sense that you've had a divorce, your divorce deal is done, and you can put that behind you and get on with your second marriage or your freedom or whatever it is. Well, that's far from the case. I guess you've got, well, maybe talking about this metaphor or something. You got alimony, you've got whatever, you've got other things all coming. Certainly citizens' rights and in the Northern Ireland in particular. And I think we'll come back to those, isn't it? That these issues are still live and very important.
Oh yes, exactly. I suppose in that sense, Paul, you're right to point out it's not like a typical divorce arrangement in the sense that once it's signed, that's it. Now these are enduring issues which will continue for as long as, for example, EU citizens reside in the UK, etc. And clearly the Northern Ireland protocol will remain of great significance for quite some time to come. So yes, but it governed basically the essence of how the UK should leave.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Super. And then I guess over a year, a little bit over, maybe quite a bit over a year from that, and you mentioned just leading up to Christmas 2020, was this the conclusion of the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? And so what does this do? How does it differ and from the withdrawal agreement, and what does it do?
Well, the withdrawal agreement, as I say, was governing the terms of how the UK should exit as a member state. Then the EU and the UK as now a non-EU state had to negotiate the terms of what their relationship would be. We are clearly geographically proximate, with barely miles between the UK and the continent. There was 47 years of close relationships to be unraveled. It was very important that there had to be an agreement, although not everybody shared this, of course, because some people thought we could sally off on a no-deal basis, but it was actually very important that the EU arranged the terms of how its future relationship would work with the UK. And this is what was produced. 1,500 pages agreed on Christmas Eve 2020, incredibly long document, which basically contains some of the following things. Now, it might be 1,500 pages long, and there are indeed added documents as well, which make it even longer. But fundamentally, it is at its core a free trade agreement, Paul. In short, it governs how goods can travel between the EU and the UK. Okay, that's what it amounts to. So the free trade agreement part provides for zero tariffs and quotas between the UK and the EU. That's in part 2 of the TCA. A third part of the TCA includes important provisions on law enforcement, criminal law, and judicial cooperation. Areas which I know you will be very familiar with as an extradition law expert. So these are all governed also by a part of the TCA. They are complex, really complex. I didn't produce a copy of the image of the governance arrangements on a slide. I just thought it would be too off-putting, but they are really complex governance arrangements which have been produced under the TCA, as you can imagine. In addition, there are terms on fisheries, energy, transport, etc. And there's discussion also of the extent to which the UK will be or will not be involved in certain EU programs which were obviously part and parcel of what the UK did while it was a member state. So for example, I'm sure most people know the UK opted not to be in Erasmus and no longer will be part of technically the European arrest warrant system. So that's just a very, very, very quick overview clearly of what the TCA does. So it is thinly, many would say, thinly rearranges the relationship between the UK now as what's called a third country, that is a non-EU member state, and the EU going forwards. The document will be reviewed within 5 years, so it's not of, long-lasting duration. So it will be reviewed within 5 years, but it should more or less govern how we relate to the EU for the next short while.
Great, thank you, Carole. That's very useful, and I guess that brings to my mind a point we had discussed before we started. We're giving a very broad brush overview of some of the issues that arise. I mean, we could it would probably take us a month to cover in any detail that fully or comprehensively. So I guess I just wanted to make that point to our audience as well. We're giving sort of the highlight package, as it were, of some of the highlights or some of the particular notable features, and I guess even these, I mean, we see in the news, the free zero tariffs. Well, I think that is accurate, isn't it? But there's other sort of regulations and product other details for trade lawyers to roll over. But
Yes.
you see in the news sometimes about the export of fish or something, wasn't it? Shellfish or salmon from Scotland was being held up for regulatory reasons or documentation reasons, which of course wasn't the case when we had seamless trade with the EU.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. That's a good point. We may return to that right at the end, in fact, when we discuss the nature of the promised land which this agreement has produced. Because while tariffs, that is customs duties, have been abolished, non-tariff barriers have effectively been reintroduced. So customs checks, which is really the main stumbling block that you're speaking about, particularly for Scottish shellfish and similar products, is what is proving to be really problematic, because they have been retained now, or reintroduced rather, between the UK and the EU.
Yes, I know. I don't want to monopolize it all. I would just remember from my studying European law years ago, it was always quantitative measures or of something of equivalent effect, wasn't it? And so there's all these trade barriers that can arise that are not just, you're only allowed to export X amount in either in numbers of goods or value of goods, but these other restrictions that could be found. And there's a whole huge body of case law from the NECJ on that issue. I remember that well. Okay, so we've got these agreements, and certainly the TCA, and all of you that know anything about international law would know that a treaty doesn't take full and permanent force until it is ratified by both parties to it, the last step in the conclusion of a treaty. So have these agreements been ratified, Carole?
Well, in short, Paul, as you'll see there from the UK side, as I mentioned previously, the UK Parliament has done effectively everything from its perspective, from its side, and domestic legislation has indeed been introduced for both the WA in the form of that EU Withdrawal Agreement Act and the TCA in the form of the EU Future Relationship Act 2020. I should just mention an aside in case people weren't watching this, the EU Future Relationship Act 2020, I mean, a detail about it which can't go, I think, unnoted, is that the entire 1,500 pages and counting went through every single scrutiny stage in the Westminster Parliament in a mere 5 hours once Parliament had been recalled on the 30th of December just last year. Incredibly, and it received indeed the royal assent that very night. So we've had 5 days effectively of scrutiny of the whole future relationship scenario, okay? That contrasts quite significantly with the EU, because yes, indeed, the withdrawal agreement has indeed been ratified, and the EU went through its whole ratification process end of January 2020, thus allowing the UK to leave by effectively 11 o'clock on the 31st of January 2020. That's fine. However, things are not quite so simple when it comes to the latest stage, the TCA. Because what's happening with ratification with that, unfortunately, is currently a delay. I was even monitoring what was happening with the delay just this very morning. Because the procedure, just to indulge in a little bit of detail here, the procedure whereby the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the Christmas Eve Agreement, must be ratified by the EU is laid out, as you can imagine, in the EU treaties. But to make it simple, the TCA must be approved, consent must be given to it by the European Parliament. Now, thus far, the TCA has only got provisional application. both parties have agreed initially to provisional application until the end of February, and they've extended that now until the end of April, which we are getting very proximate to. And the indications, unfortunately, even this morning, was that the European Parliament has not yet set a date whereby the TCA will be put before its plenary sitting. It's only got one plenary sitting between now and the end of April, on the 26th of April, effectively. So it's not yet agreed that the TCA will be voted on and discussed there. So there is, we've come already now to this issue of, is Brexit done? We already begin to see the unraveling of the whole idea that Brexit is done, because the EU effectively has not yet ratified the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So the 5 hours in the Westminster Parliament is beginning to contrast quite significantly with what is edging now towards being 5 months by the EU.
Right. So I guess there is a theoretical possibility that the EU refuses to ratify it, and then it would just, I guess, fall by the wayside, the agreement, and there would be no deal. That's a theoretical possibility. Do you think that's an actual possibility?
That's your capturing of the scenario is exactly 100% correct, Paul. Indeed, we would revert to the famed no deal scenario. I think, really reading between the lines, I think it's most unlikely that the European Parliament won't eventually vote on and consent to this document. But anything could happen. But I genuinely, I think it's probably in the EU's interest also to ratify this, and for people to move forwards. So yeah, but what you say, if they do fail to give consent to it by a simple majority, then unfortunately we are in really difficult situation, because it will be a no deal scenario.
Okay, so we're, I guess, on this sort of formal technical document aspects of the Brexit process, we're kind of maybe almost done. Is that, I don't know, or heading towards finishing, maybe.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah, but I just thought it was worthwhile mentioning. There's just an image. We didn't go into that in more detail. I thought it was worthwhile people knowing that Brexit is certainly not done, okay, on the EU side, because it hasn't yet been ratified. And as I said, this very morning, I read a note about how the Parliament has not yet fixed a date whereby it will be voted.
Yeah, and I know we'll just say just a brief point about this, but the EU is often criticized for its democratic deficit. Well, here you've got a democratic elected parliament playing an absolutely critical role in this process, isn't it? I mean, so that sort of
absolutely well said, Paul. And as I say, I suppose I was making a sort of jovial point about the 5 hours the TCA sort of ran through the Westminster Parliament. I mean, it really, to a sense, makes a mockery of democracy on our side, on the UK side, whereas lengthy consideration and debate on it in the European Parliament will be very important. And I'm sure people will scrutinise the European Parliament documents that come out of that scrutiny for a very long time to come.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so we're saying we're maybe almost done in that sense. Not done in other senses, or there's been sort of developments in and around these recent processes that have sent signals, I suppose, haven't there, to the wider public and from one party to the other. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's very well put, Paul. That's very nicely put. Indeed, sending signals. I think if you were going for sending a signal to the EU, you couldn't be more overt than denying the EU delegation full diplomatic status. Now, this is a political issue, okay, a diplomatic issue. It's not as important as the whole legal issue of non-ratification, but this has been ongoing now for over a year, and the UK is refusing to grant full diplomatic status to what we would call the EU ambassador. And currently the EU delegation sits in this rather ambiguous hybrid status in London, whereby it does not have full diplomatic status, and the UK is not calling this person the EU ambassador. I mean, really it is, as you say, it's about sending signals. It's really, it's this, partly it's to do with this kind of, will I use the word obsession? I'm trying to think of an alternative word to obsession. It's to do with the emphasis which the UK has had on sovereignty as the core of Brexit, okay? So we left the EU because we want to recover in full our sovereignty, restore it in full. And equally, to paraphrase, the UK will not recognise the EU's delegation because the EU isn't a sovereign body in the UK's eyes. They're calling it merely an international organisation. So, you know, that's a pretty big signal. You know, we've left, but it's not enough for us to left to deal with our, you know, our own, as it were, domestic affairs. We must also, if you like, to some degree, punish our former partner. So it seems a bit petty, but it's, you know, it's important certainly in diplomatic circles.
I think, I mean, the saying "cutting off your nose to spite your face" sort of springs to mind. I mean, even if the UK or the EU, pardon me, is not, you know, akin to a sovereign state in historical terms, it has the lawful authority to enter into, amongst other things, trade agreements, you know, and for on behalf of all the 27 other countries, and so it's clearly in the UK's interest to
Yeah,
you know, to
correct.
play ball.
Yeah, and I should say that 142 other states, apart from the UK, all recognise the full diplomatic status of the EU, and their representative is always referred to as the EU ambassador wherever they are located. There's only one unfortunate sad precedent here, because the former president of the United States, before Mr. Biden, did also actually remove full diplomatic status from the EU. So that's where we are. Okay.
Yeah, that tells you something, I think. We spoke at the start about in the withdrawal agreement about the Northern Ireland Protocol, and sadly, just this past week or so, I've seen serious violence in Northern Ireland. I mean, what is, you know, I know there's probably no one answer, and one could speak for a long time and think about it, about the situation in Northern Ireland, but what, how can you give our audience a brief, you know, discussion or description of Northern Ireland and what's happened?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I mean, very difficult. I mean, it's an 800-year-old problem, which resurrected itself once again, literally just last week. That image is unfortunately an image of a bus being hijacked and set alight in Belfast just one evening last week, which unfortunately is, and very sadly, is representative of a return of a certain amount of violence in Northern Ireland. And that was really incredibly difficult, I think, for everybody observing Northern Ireland to see this happen. I won't say, I mean, I'm no Northern Irish expert, but I won't say that all the violence which erupted last week was totally to do with Brexit. However, I have read a lot about those protests and listened to various interesting podcasts about them. And it seems that they were actually two trigger points. One was actually the funeral of a very important IRA leader last June in the middle of COVID lockdown, and the police announced at the end of March that they were not going to prosecute anybody for attending that funeral in the large numbers that they did. And therefore that was seen as a message. It wasn't intended to be, I'm sure, but it was seen as a message to the loyalist communities, who were largely the people protesting just last week, that the police were effectively, you know, and working in tandem with the nationalist Sinn Féin communities. But if you listen to and read the things about the protest last week, it wasn't just that trigger point about the failure to prosecute the nationalist people who went to the funeral. There's very, very definite knowledge about and a sense of alienation being caused by the Irish sea border. So let's just briefly talk about what that means. I've already told you that the withdrawal agreement includes a part of it called the Protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. The reason why Northern Ireland received constantly over the last few years such a degree of attention in the Brexit context is because there clearly would be, once the UK left, as we now have, there would be a land border between an EU state, namely Ireland, and a non-EU state, namely the UK. And it was how to manage that border became the issue. Now, it isn't as if the UK doesn't, sorry, I beg your pardon, it isn't as if the EU doesn't already have land borders with non-EU states. I mean, Switzerland comes to mind, Belarus, etc. Okay, these are not uncommon. The problem is the whole history, the 800-year-old legacy of of violence, effectively, on the island of Ireland. And the fear by many that however Brexit would handle the whole border situation would lead to a resurrection of violence. And that is, in fact, what has happened. The way, unfortunately, the withdrawal agreement, Mr. Johnson's version of it, handled the Northern Irish problem was to produce something called an Irish sea border, which basically means that goods coming from the UK now get stopped at Northern Irish ports. So this is both symbolically and practically incredibly important, because many in Northern Ireland fear they've been set adrift as now a distinct and lesser part of the Union of the United Kingdom because of Brexit. And you can imagine the feelings that has actually caused in some communities in Northern Ireland. So, one could literally, we could be talking until next Christmas about Northern Ireland, but that's, I hope, has summed up and given an idea of the sort of the matrix of complexities which Brexit has just added into in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess just maybe ever so short mention of the last point, and something I came across and something I was involved in is a human rights provision in the protocol that Brexit, including the trade and cooperation agreement, will not lead to a diminution of rights, of human rights protection in Northern Ireland, and that's something that may, obviously not as dramatic as the violence or the fires, but it could lead to some litigation and some real consequences as well in due course.
Yes, we've got a little slide later on about human rights. We may come back to that, Paul. But yes, just at this point, I wanted to highlight that, Northern Ireland is distinct for many reasons. Okay, it was even before Brexit, is now even more distinct. And indeed, that article, which is actually in the protocol of the withdrawal agreement, Paul, not in the TCA, Article 2 of the protocol. Yeah, just to make sure that we're talking about the right one. That may indeed prove to make Northern Ireland, even more apart from the rest of the United Kingdom.
Excellent, thank you, Carole. So I think we're only right that we'll mention Northern Ireland. I think it's one of maybe the more pronounced flashpoint, but I think obviously coming from our university's location in the northeast of Scotland, we should mention, and also I guess with an election coming up in a few weeks, that may be of some relevance, but what happened in Scotland, and I think everybody is probably pretty well aware that the pretty clear majority of individuals who resident in Scotland voted to remain in the EU. But do you want to mention Scotland's position, Carole?
I won't dwell upon it at such length because, in a sense, Scotland's position, I suppose, is all purely hypothetical. Because the major issue resulting from Brexit for Scotland is, against the background of that 62% Remain vote poll, the major issue now is what can or should happen with Scotland should Scotland have another independence referendum. And the stated aim, of course, is of the current government, if they lead us through in that direction, for Scotland to rejoin the European Union. But a lot has to happen before that is even on the table. Okay, it may be the stated aim, but it's not entirely a given that Scotland would be able to join very easily. There remain complex issues about the euro. Would we adopt that in Scotland? Would we have to follow all the normal procedures for a new state, etc.? So there are very definite questions over what's going to happen to Scotland. But I don't think it's going to be a naturally easy route towards rejoining the EU, but I can very definitely see it happening clearly if we do get a vote for independence, which of course is a big if in itself.
Yeah, I remember I don't know when this discussion was held, maybe it was at the same time as the first independence referendum, was it? And that, my understanding was there's certainly certain other member states who would be reluctant to willingly welcome Scotland back, lest parts of Spain or France or Belgium or something decide to, follow Scotland's footsteps and see the breakup of Spain or France or Belgium. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
No, it was Spain, absolutely. It was Spain at the time, and of course Catalonia. But I think the mood has actually changed. Just to sort of generally say it, the mood has actually changed, and I think within EU circles now, Paul, there is a very large degree of support for Scotland becoming
Hmm.
one of the next new member states. I mean, clearly there's a queue, Albania, Iceland, Montenegro. There's a whole queue of people already lining up to become a new member state. So Scotland, I think, would be, by and large, seen as a welcome member of that queue to join.
Okay, so thank you for that, Carole. I guess one of the things that springs to mind in this whole Brexit debate and was hammered home by the Brexiteers was, well, I guess the general sentiment is we don't want European bureaucrats making decisions that affect us, but and especially European judges pronouncing definitive rules, which oblige our courts to act in our courts in our whole country, I suppose, in consequence, to act in a certain way. So as that happened, we could say, are we in the promised land judicially?
Indeed, Paul, we are not, because the large part of our conversation today is all about what is not done. And indeed, yes, as you rightly said, Paul, the getting rid of the power of the Luxembourg court was seen as a red line as part of the negotiations between the UK and the EU. That's summed up there by that quotation, which I think is possibly from Mrs. May, but I forget it was not. But anyway, it's summed up by this quotation: laws will be interpreted by judges, not in Luxembourg, which is where the EU court is based, but in courts across this country. We will be free effectively to make our own laws without the interference of these alien European judges. That was very much the sort of the tenor, the register of the Brexit negotiations. But like much of what we're talking about today, Paul, the reality is quite different. Because just to not go into the detail here, we may go into the detail if needs be in questions afterwards, but just to let people know that the CJEU, which is what the EU court is called formally, it retains a not insignificant role under the terms of the withdrawal agreement. So, for example, CJEU is quite likely to see cases being taken by the Commission against the UK for breaches of EU law, which occurred before we left. That can continue for up to 4 years. People may be appalled to see headlines even in 3.5 years' time saying UK being taken to court by the EU. That can go on for 4 years. Equally, the CJEU has got right to hear cases relating to EU citizens in the UK for up to 8 years after we've left. So again, one can only imagine the headlines in certain newspapers in quite a distant time future saying, why is this EU court still doing this? Simply because it was agreed in the withdrawal agreement. Contrary to this notion that we were completely ridding ourselves of the Luxembourg court, as I say, the reality isn't quite so simplistic.
So Brexit is far from done in that perspective. I suppose 8 years down the road, it's still ongoing. Thank you. I guess another one aspect of this cutting the UK adrift from the EU was a human rights element, in that the EU, pardon me, of course, has concluded the Fundamental Charter of Human Rights, which is a very critical document of EU law, and akin but wider than other international agreements, human rights agreements that the UK is party to. What has happened to that?
Well, this whole area I just find absolutely fascinating, and I think one that is really going to be just hugely important in the next few years. Both you and I work in this area, and we're just going to see this being one of increasing importance, I would say, Paul, because in short, okay, the EU had its own Bill of Rights, to use a cliche. It was called the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. It dates from about 20 years ago. It acquired legal force about 10 years ago, but an incredibly important document, okay, which governed an awful lot of what happened in terms of the EU and, of course, the UK while we were still a member state. A decision was taken by the UK very, very, very early on that once the UK left, we would no longer be bound by this charter. Okay, so that was the jettisoning of the charter was put into an act in 2018. It was made quite clear that once we left, as from date of exit, this this EU Bill of Rights, I should say, would no longer apply. So we just need to be clear about that. The Charter is no longer relevant for the UK. However, in contradistinction, the UK, as I'm sure most listeners will know, the UK has been a party to another European Bill of Rights called the European Convention on Human Rights since 1950. That has governed human rights protection and development for, the last 70 years. Really important document, clearly. But just to be clear, because people do get confused about this, not least, students or politicians get confused about it. The UK leaving the EU has not so far, and is not designed to have any impact on the UK's affiliation to the European Convention on Human Rights. However, there's a but, okay? There's a little bit of a but there because, first of all, as many people will know, the UK government at the moment, and indeed going back a good 10 years, similar iterations of this government have professed some hostility towards the UK's affiliation to the European Convention. And so it's recently, for example, it's launched a review of the Human Rights Act, which gives effect to the European Convention within the UK. So that is seen as a little bit of a threat to the UK's affiliation to this convention. But the EU, possibly anticipating that something like this was going to occur further down the line, the EU has put certain terms into the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, setting out a degree of conditionality in relation to the UK abiding by the European Convention. They're quite complex and they're in several parts of the TCA. I won't go into the detail here. Again, we can do that in the chat if necessary, but just enough for people to know that there is some degree by which the EU effectively is monitoring the UK's compliance with the Strasbourg European Convention on Human Rights.
Yeah, this is I think worth emphasizing this point, and I suppose it would irritate, I guess, Brexiteers or something, that within the agreement there are conditions that have been placed upon the United Kingdom that it must act in a certain way in order for the agreement to subsist, right, to continue going forward.
Absolutely.
And one is that the UK has remains a party to the ECHR and gives domestic effect to its terms. Right. I suppose how it particularly does that, it could be a subject of debate, but that the UK is obliged to act in that way. Yep. According, I guess, right, you say maybe the EU, or I assume the EU was concerned that to partner with a country that wasn't adhering to the terms of the ECHR.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and that's really fascinating because. There is only one other European state geographically which isn't party to the ECHR, that's Belarus, So I really think the EU did not want to see the UK turn into Belarus version 2.
Yes, exactly. What springs to my mind, and I don't know if we're going to come to this a little bit later, but I know when you mentioned criminal cooperation earlier, another aspect of this conditionality is UK's data protection. In a data adequacy decision, the EU has to, in order to continue to agree to cooperate with the United Kingdom, has to scrutinize the United Kingdom's data protection regime. And if it deems it not sufficiently compatible with the rules within the EU, it can stop cooperating. And that would have huge ramifications. So just another example of the EU requiring the UK to live up to certain standards in a very general sense. That's not the best way to put it.
Absolutely. And clearly the UK did not want to give in to all standards as set by the EU, but some were accepted in the sort of the deal that was wrung out of the two parties by Christmas Eve.
Let me just, I'm just checking. I'm looking at my thing. Oh, we're still doing okay for time. We got 5:45, but we'll speed up maybe if we can. So what about the next question? And this is again alluded to in the withdrawal agreement, or referred to. Well, that was citizens' rights, and maybe this is a slightly different thing. But what about EU citizenship, Carole?
Well, EU citizenship, of course, ended effectively on exit day, first exit day for UK nationals. It ended on 31st of January 2020. Free movement continued for UK nationals until the end of transition. So that's now gone as well too, okay? So citizenship is effectively abolished for all UK nationals because the UK is no longer a member state. However, if only it were that simple, because while I won't go into the detail of it here today, I just wanted to give people an insight into the extent to which the lawyers, the lawyers are pursuing this issue with great gusto in various courts. So for example, there are currently at least 3 cases going through the EU court, the Luxembourg court, whereby 3 separate individuals are challenging the removal of EU citizenship from UK nationals, saying they didn't consent to it, they didn't have the right to consent to it, they had no vote in the referendum, etc. And they believe this to be an illegal deprivation, to sum it up quite simply. So there's that happening. There's a similar case actually just started literally last week, also going through the European Convention on Human Rights. And there are equally 2 further cases going through the French courts, which have been referred to the Luxembourg court, which are again all about the position of UK nationals living in France who have lost their EU citizenship, because clearly all UK nationals have lost their UK citizenship unless they are dual nationals of another member state. And these people in particular, their argument is very interesting because as many people may know, if you are a UK citizen who moves to live abroad, you lose the right to vote in all UK elections after you've been abroad for 15 years, the 15-year rule, okay? All your electoral rights in the UK lapse after 15 years. But what's happened to many of these UK nationals who moved to EU member states completely legitimately, acting on citizenship and free movement, they've now lost, of course, because they've been abroad for longer than 15 years, they've lost all UK voting rights, but equally, because they've lost their EU citizenship, they've lost their right to vote, for example, in French local elections. So they have no longer, they literally have no longer have any right to vote anywhere. So you can see the sense of injustice which is percolating through many of these cases. And this one is not, this is certainly an aspect of Brexit, which is definitely not done, okay? I don't know if the outcome of any of these cases will be the resurrection of EU citizenship for any UK nationals, but you never know. All I'm saying is this is certainly an area to watch also.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Not everybody would be aware of this. And I guess maybe a different side, or the other side of that coin could be about settled status within the UK, as opposed to former or UK nationals, former EU nationals living abroad. What about settled status? Is that done?
Absolutely, Paul. This is a very good point. Very well put as well too. It literally is 2 sides of the same coin. So I suppose the previous slide was all about the position of those with UK citizenship, what's happened to them in other EU member states. This issue of the undoneness of the settled status relates to what is the position of EU citizens who moved to and lived in the UK, of whom they number at least 3.5 million. We're not talking about tiny numbers of people here. There are at least 3.5 million EU nationals living in the UK. And the way in which the UK decided to handle effectively their immigration status was to say that all of them and us, okay, status. And there's a completely hard deadline on this. It has to be applied for by the 30th of June this year. So literally less than 100 days left before people apply for this. The problematic thing, Paul, which is why this is not done, you might think, oh, that's simple, you can do it online, okay? Problematic thing is that as campaigners have been stating for years, this is going to be really, really difficult for some people. Vulnerable and marginalized groups who don't even know about this rather peculiar new immigration status, who might think that if they've been in the UK for decades that they're not affected by Brexit. People who don't have access to the internet, we may think that's strange, but many people don't. So in short, many campaigners are deeply concerned about what's going to happen on this hard deadline of 30th of June 2020, when technically speaking, all those who haven't applied and achieved either full settled status or pre-settled status risk effectively being deported because they no longer have any immigration status in the UK. Now, literally just last week, the government did produce some guidance in relation to those who missed the deadline. But, again, I'm not quite sure that's fully reassured the campaigners, because there will be people who decades in the future will be affected by the lack of EU settled status having been achieved. So it is definitely an undone part of Brexit also.
Yes, and could be a very big issue. I mean, we saw the Windrush generation issue, not that long ago. And this is, of course, very, very different, but in some sense could be similar, as you say, for people who have lived here for years, who raised a family, contributed to the well-being of the economy and society, and face deportation. Okay, so now I guess maybe somebody, and I think both didn't claim to be trade lawyers earlier, so we won't have to go too much deals for this, but often making the newspapers recently, since the end of the year, has been these sort of stories. So I think, would we be in the promised land in this sense, Carole, and maybe in a trade and economic sense?
Well, I have to say that until literally yesterday, Paul, I haven't seen a positive media headline reporting on Brexit. So this was just a tiny selection of the headlines I knew obviously we were going to have our conversation. I was amassing some headlines, trying to give, a sort of a succinct overview of some of the problems that have been encountered in Brexit land. Yesterday, I saw some headline claiming that trading figures with the EU were up 12%. Then somebody was even breaking that down and saying that's not quite true. So really, I just wanted to choose a selection of between 1 January this year and literally yesterday, an overview of the kind of problems that have been encountered by people since Brexit actually happened, since transition ended on New Year's Eve last year. And you'd see there, a lot of them do concern fisheries, of course. Fisheries were a major part of the Brexit negotiations. That was all about rights to fish in the waters. What's transpired is that the fishers, and the processing people and the exporters had been hit by these customs checks, and all the technical controls that there are on certain kinds of food products going to the EU. So you can see there the figures are ginormous, and indeed, in terms of case law to come, I think the shellfish organizations in the UK are planning on taking a case against the UK government in relation to this. So it's far from a promised land, certainly for certain sectors of the UK economy, Paul.
Yeah, I know. I've saw those as well. I think everybody has, and maybe there is an occasional other side. And there was James Dyson yesterday was on about the benefits as he sees it. So of course there are other perspectives. Okay, this, I suppose, our quote is, I guess it's not just sensationalist pro EU newspapers, but here's the House of Lords, which I think generally one can trust is an impartial and by and large a body. And this is what I've seen. I guess I'm just reading the newspaper headlines about small businesses having to incur great expense and set up a warehouse or an office in continental Europe to
absolutely, or else pay huge sums for get somebody to handle their customs forms to export even tiny things to the EU.
Mm-hmm.